Thank you so much, Anna, for inviting me. Thanks to the Department of European Ethnology and Anthropology here at Pécs. Thanks also to the Rachel Carson Center for making this visit possible. It's my first visit to Hungary, and it's a delight to be here. Pécs is a beautiful city, and it's been wonderful to spend the last couple days exploring a bit of it. And this talk, as Anna mentioned, is part of a larger ERC Advanced grant. That's titled, we've changed the name. It's Fragments of the Forest, Hot Zones, Disease Ecologies, and the Changing Landscape of Health and Environment in West Africa. And it involves an interdisciplinary team. And here is our group. Musa Duno, who is a physician and medical anthropologist, Shadrach Kerwillian, who's a conservation biologist, Emmanuelle Roth, a postdoc on the project, trained in medical and social anthropology, myself with a background in environmental history and the history of science and medicine, and John Fea, who is trained as a molecular biologist. And collectively, we've come together to explore the environmental, economic, political, and social forces, as well as knowledge regimes that have made the Ghanaian forests of West Africa into a hotspot where biodiversity conservation concerns, emerging infectious disease threats, and resource extraction converge. So we're each, Musa and Shadrach and John are each pursuing their PhD projects on this. Emma is pursuing her own book project. I also am pursuing a book project tentatively titled Bloodborne, Chasing Ecologies and Power Across Viral Divides. And this book project focuses on 3 viruses: yellow fever, hepatitis B, and Ebola, across a century of biomedical research in West Africa from the 1920s to the present day. The fluidity with which viruses can cross the divides, separating human, non-human primates and other species, proved vital to understanding the natural history of viruses and their control. In West Africa, where colonial resource extraction ushered in immense ecological, economic, political, and social change, flows of capital and the building of infrastructure facilitated the search for viruses in the Ghanaian forests of West Africa that extend from Sierra Leone to Nigeria. The blood, viruses, insects, and wildlife specimens collected in this region became a foundation upon which Western scientific understandings of viral infectious diseases and their ecologies were built, and maps representing West Africa as a disease hotspot were made. Each virus takes us into a different fragment of the Ghanaian forests at a different moment in time to make visible how changing ecological understanding of viruses and power relations shaped by colonial, neo-colonial, and neoliberal regimes altered alliances among living things, human and non-human, in the Ghanaian forests of West Africa. So today, Emma and I want to take you to a particular place, that of Mount Nimba, which is on the borders of Liberia, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. And to take us one of the important fragments of the Ghanaian forests of West Africa. So to begin, faint sounds, high-pitched and squeaky, let's see if we can, echo up from a cavernous pit of twisted steel and concrete into which we peer. At twilight's edge, the dry season's intense midday sun has mellowed into a cool orange glow as bats take flight. Moses, a middle-aged Liberian park ranger with a solid frame and a taste for good stories, expresses his anxiousness as we lean just a bit further over the chasm below. One man met his end here already, attempting to salvage steel scraps from the abandoned conveyor shaft. Moses holds in his hands our care and protection, and that of the bats who reside in these fragments of a once prosperous iron ore mine. We stand on a plateau in the southern reach of the Mount Nimba range. High mountain peaks form a 40-kilometer chain of sky islands that capture moisture-laden clouds and tower above the rainforest below. Mists envelope the summits and slopes of this highest mountain range in West Africa, which marks the tri-border region where Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, and Guinea meet. Below us, rugged rock walls step down to Blue Lake, which you see here. A shoreline signpost warns the trickle of tourists who visit the former mining site, turned nature reserve, swim at your own risk. The plateau where we stand was once subterranean itself, before men and machine whittled down this part of the Mount Nimba range. In 1990, 2 decades of open pit iron ore extraction had ended. Depletion of the main iron ore body, departure of a major investor and buyer, and disarray wrought by the outbreak of Liberia's civil wars left the landscape abandoned, but for the squeaky creatures rustling below. With time, the terraced roads carved to move heavy mining equipment crumbled to form the lake basin. Across the plateau, the highest remaining remnant of Mount Nimba is a pile of low rubble resembling the ruins of an ancient Inca temple. The sculpted vistas and fragmented landscapes of Mount Nimba give us a glimpse of what human, non-human, and inanimate beings can be to each other. Welcome. High concentrations of endemic species threatened by extinction earned this fragment of the Ghanaian forests of West Africa hotspot status in 2000. And this is these represent fragments of the Ghanaian upper forest, which was this forest that extended, as I said, from Sierra Leone to Nigeria. It was one of 25, now 36, areas on Earth designated by conservation biologists as a place of critical endangerment in need of protection. Mount Nimba also lies very close to the site where in 2013, the Ebola disease became visible for the first time in West Africa. Ecologists came to posit a correlation between biodiversity loss and disease emergence. In the post-Ebola landscape of pandemic preparedness, Mount Nimba has garnered new attention by virus hunters as a potential hotspot, not only of biodiversity, but of emerging infectious diseases as well. Over the last 60 years, natural scientists, mining engineers, and multinational firms, as well as scrappers and tourists, have come to the Mount Nimba region to extract value, both living and inert, from its landscape. As open pit mining yielded to a nature reserve, the welfare benefits provided by a mine to its workers shifted to include more diffuse forms of corporate social responsibility that extended care to the non-human world. In Nimba, the interests of mining, conservation, pandemic preparedness, livelihoods, and ecotourism converge, collaborate, and collide. Blue Lake lies in the middle of the East Nimba Nature Reserve, where international mining conglomerate ArcelorMittal has been piloting a biodiversity conservation program since 2011. It is one place among many on Earth where the relationships between mining and conservation are intensifying and deepening. From the vantage point of the Peruvian Andes, geographer Timothy Norris sees, and I quote, hotspots of biodiversity and extractive investment as two sides of the same coin. In Liberia, Peru, Madagascar, and Gabon, mining and conservation both work to gain control over land and resources in the creation of commodity frontiers. Both depend on the formalization of territory and the parceling of land, whether a mining concession or a protected park, to extract value in capitalism's quest for cheap nature and cheap labor. The synergy of mining and conservation, however, constitute more than a winning bet to assert control over and extract value from nature. Moses insists that many of the bats below us migrate to the pit, however man-made, in the dry season. This is the mining adit, where the old mining adit where bats were found. The underground artifice is the coolest crevice at this altitude. In the Nimba region, rare species can hardly be detached from the abandoned mining equipment, shafts, and adits that are now their home. In Mount Nimba, the living now depend on a landscape sculpted by giant earth movers, dynamite, and the toil of people. Neither political ecology nor multi-species ethnography can fully make sense of the fractured formations that comprise Nimba's geology and life history. With an acknowledgement to the recent geo-turn in the humanities, we ask in this talk what new social worlds and power relations appear when we extend constituent players beyond the living to include, for example, the Earth's rock strata or the discarded remains of human activities. Capitalism, we argue in this talk, fragments nature to make value. Surveys of Mount Nimba separated high-grade iron ore and useful timber from waste rock and worthless trees before mining and logging began. But fragmentation of Mount Nimba for profit also created spaces of endangerment. Habitat destruction threatens the lives of rare endemic species, like the viviparous Nimba toad. On fragmented edges of the forest, new relations among people, viruses, and their animal hosts are thought to give rise to zoonotic diseases like Ebola. These hotspots of endangerment accrue value in an era where market mechanisms, from offsets to ecotourism, are seen by organizations like the World Bank as tools of nature conservation and pandemic prevention. The hotspot plays a role in many tales of the Anthropocene. In this talk, we attend to a genealogy of the hotspot whose multiple beginnings offer points of entry into the relations between rocks, animals, viruses, and capital that constitute Mount Nimba. How Nimba became a hotspot, and how, in turn, this designation has altered relations among the living and non-living occupants of the region is a question that guides the journey of an anthropologist, Emma, and a historian, myself, through this fragment of the Upper Ghanaian forests of West Africa. So I'm going to turn to part one, which is rocks. The name Nimba comes from Niembatun, a Mano expression that means hills on which a young maiden slipped and fell. As we traverse the sculpted, grass-covered summit along a razor-thin edge, the place name seems apt. A unique combination of climate and geology form the precipitous escarpments of the Nimba Mountains. The pre-Cambrian spine of quartzite, permeated at heights above 1,000 meters with high-grade iron ore, has been showered by tropical rains for several hundred million years. Erosion of the softer granitic gneiss and schist formations laid bare iron-rich rock and made mining easy. Green iron, the best according to Moses, and whose color testifies to a chemical reaction between iron and hydroxide, is still abundant around Blue Lake. In the early 1950s, Scottish geologist Sandy Clark conducted exploratory surveys on the Liberian side of Mount Nimba. The survey found high-grade iron ore exposed on the mountain ridge and lower-grade itabarite accessible downslope. 250 million tons of iron ore, valued at more than $7 billion in 1955, lay there. Clark's efforts depended upon the knowledge and labor of people in the neighboring village of Bapa. Among Mano and Pele people, the ability to transform iron ore into tools and weapons had long been revered, and smithing was a closely guarded art. Nimba's iron ore had been essential to the contested territory in the chiefdom wars that raged in the late 19th century along the Upper Guinean coast. In 1955, the Liberian-American-Swedish mining company Lamco, a joint venture between the Liberian government, Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and a Swedish syndicate, was formed. The Stockholms and Skilda Bank and the mining conglomerate Gränges was entrusted not only with the mining operation, but in their words, quote, civic and social responsibility that would result in a project of major importance for the economic and social development of Liberia. Major open pit mining began in 1963. Within a year, men and machines removed between 7.5 and 10 million tons of iron ore and 100 meters of rock, where Blue Lake now sits. In the concession, many things besides rock were fair game for extraction and capitalization. From the manufactured plateau, Moses points in the direction of a few Pipta Daniastrum and Lofira, ideal woods for railway sleepers and harbor construction, critical to the movement of iron ore from mountain to sea. Waste rock was used to fill in low-lying wetlands at the mountain's base, where miners' camps soon sprouted adjacent to the booming town of Yakepa. We also spot some tall sugar plum and yangan trees whose timber has been used by Liberians for carpentry, furniture, and dugout canoes. As the region became economically attractive, the forest was increasingly fragmented to serve the needs of the company and its workers. They cut down the trees. This is why the air became so hot down in the valley, Moses complains. Later, in the village of Zoloway, elders speak nostalgically of Lamco. We convened a meeting to evoke memories of the company, but many more interested residents come to record the old men with their phone. From the shaded veranda where we all sit, we can see Mount Tokade, another Nimba mountain, being eaten away by the machines of a new mining company, ArcelorMittal. The old men look back upon Lamco, in contrast to ArcelorMittal, with affection. One worker remembers fondly the comfortable housing with 24-hour electricity and hospital facilities equipped with trained doctors from Sweden, Germany, the United States, and other parts of the world that Lamco provided to salaried employees. In Yakepa, a town built by Lamco, the once modern worker housing, swimming pool, school, guest house, and cinema mark a past where free housing, healthcare, education, and entertainment help fulfill corporate social responsibility. Lamco also built a water purification plant and a piping system that turned the Ya River and its mountainous effluents into safe drinking water. Sewage was treated, transformed into manure, and distributed to farmers. When few people in West Africa experienced the benefits of the welfare state, Lamco directed parts of its profits into population care. Hard-fought struggle, which no one mentions, brought such benefits. In the mid-1960s, strikes in Yakepa and the port of Buchanan organized by the National Mine Workers Association for Higher Wages, culminated in a July 1966 confrontation between Liberian mine workers, Swedish management, and the Liberian military and police. A Swedish television crew documented police brutality, squalid living conditions, and alleged malnutrition suffered by Liberian LAMCO workers during the strike. The resulting documentary, Black Week in Nimba, sparked a national conversation when it aired on Swedish television in October 1966. The episode critically challenged the moral ideals that Swedish executives proclaimed to govern their operations abroad. Gränges and its CEO, Eric Waldenstrom, denounced the program and issued a 29-point rebuttal. But the public embarrassment resulted in the series of social welfare reforms that retired LAMCO workers remember and long for. The priority placed on worker health, education, and housing was typical of high modernist ideology and its promise of care. It was a relatively cheap and easy promise to deliver when few environmental regulations inhibited natural resource extraction in countries like Liberia, desperate to attract foreign capital for development. In 1969, Swedish conservationist Kai Curry Lindell, under the auspices of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, urged the creation of a nature reserve in the southern Nimba Range. He lamented the fragmented landscape LAMCO created, where I quote, roads cut frightful scars in dense high forest. But fragmentation was a necessary prerequisite in assessing what held value and what was worthless in the eyes of capital. Care in this instance was tied to a calculus that weighed the fluctuating value of iron ore, the demands of labor, and profit to be made. And now part 2, non-humans. One of the 10 largest tropical rainforest ecosystems on Earth, the Ghanaian forests swathe much of equatorial West Africa's coast from Sierra Leone to Nigeria, Cameroon border, and a verdant cloak. Standing with Moses at a cornerstone of the East Nimba Nature Reserve, a stone's throw from Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, we gaze over a precipice at a broccoli-like canopy of evergreen forest that spreads along the steep slopes and off into the distance. This is a fragment of the Ghanaian forests of West Africa. Its green smoothness interrupted here and there by a section of haul road, burnt trees, and patches of farmed land. Farming extended to the hills and valleys beneath Mount Nimba after LAMCO's arrival, in part as a result of the influx of workers. During the war, when LAMCO left, Moses used to accompany his parents during lulls in fighting to the slopes where they cultivated cash crops, banana, coffee, and rubber. He knows every ditch in the reserve, where so-called secondary forest has taken over the former farms. As we head back to Blue Lake, Moses draws our attention to a crab shell in a stream. It is a trace of the semi-aquatic otter shrew, one of many rare species, including the live-bearing Nimba toad, poisonous giant butterfly, and tool-using chimpanzee, that makes Mount Nimba region a prized fragment of the Ghanaian forests. The abrupt relief changes makes for a dense variety of microhabitats. Mount Nimba, according to biologists, is an Inselberg, an island in the sky. Its isolation, both climatic and geographic, contribute to the abundance of endemic plant and animal species, a metric of value to conservation biologists in promoting biodiversity. In the 1990s, as the sounds of cutlasses and guns replaced the roar of earth movers in Mount Nimba, the region was made into a biodiversity hotspot, a new source of value upon which conservation and mining converged. British conservationist Norman Myers appropriated the term hotspot in 1988 to call attention to regions of the globe with high concentrations of endemic species experiencing, in his words, extinction spasms. That is accelerated human-induced species loss due to habitat destruction and fragmentation. And you'll see here that the Ghanaian forests of West Africa are one of the biodiversity hotspots that he identified. Alarmed by the prognosis that planet Earth was entering a new period of mass extinction, Myers and his colleagues deployed the hotspot as a triage strategy. In the era of the sixth extinction, the hotspot was a silver bullet strategy that touted a simple solution to a complex problem. Concentrate the scarce resources of conservation organizations on areas where preventing further habitat loss would save the largest number of species possible. The designation of the Ghanaian forests as a hotspot was intended to attract the attention of governments and NGOs to protect, police, and care for fragments of this once vast ecosystem through acts of enclosure. In 2003, as peace came to Liberia, the interim government established the East Nimba Nature Reserve as a protected area, where once Liberian military and police forces protected Lamco property and surveyed workers, the hand of the state now protects and monitors a heavily mined peak and the rare and threatened species that still populate the fragmented landscape. Conflicts immediately arose with communities who lived in proximity to the reserve. Saeed Thompson, a farmer, artisanal miner, and former hunter and trapper who took college courses in natural resource management, told us that the East Nimba Nature Reserve was created, in his words, without community consent. In 2010, so-called community forests were established in Nimba, and Thompson was selected as chairman of a co-management committee installed for the reserve. Land rights were formalized, and conservation was to be done according to the community paradigm favored by global actors since the 1980s. And this is someone painting a clear border between the park and the community forests. And so every 20 feet, you'll see these red marks around the park. Co-management committee members ensure that park patrols do not treat the occasional hunter or the farmer encroaching onto the reserve's buffer zone too harshly. Coexistence of mining, conservation, and local livelihoods depends crucially on the mitigation of conflicts in a fragmented mosaic of discordant uses. Development of the East Nimba Nature Reserve has occurred under the auspices and with the financial support of ArcelorMittal, the #1 leading steel-producing conglomerate in the world that took over the Lamco concession. In the 21st century, transnational mining firms have become the leading source for conservation funding in much of Africa. ArcelorMittal markets itself as a custodian of Nimba, which has become the company's biodiversity offset in Liberia. The ENR is a resource commodity that benefits ArcelorMittal in appeasing shareholders and critics attuned to questions of corporate social responsibility. Since completion of an environmental impact assessment in 2010, the mining company has been intermittently funding wildlife surveys and park guards. This is meant to compensate for the environmental harms unleashed by a new wave of mountaintop removal just a few miles away on Mount Takode. Strange alliances arise where life and non-life meet in the extraction zones of mining and conservation. On the Ghanaian side of the Mount Nimba Range, a toad that gives birth to live young, the only known species in existence to do so, proved decisive in turning a nature reserve into a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981. The viviparous amphibian inhabits a mere 4 square kilometers of high-altitude grasslands above 1,200 meters. The capitalization of iron ore and the Nimba toad collided when the Société des Mines de Fer de Guinée, SMFG, learned that one of the Nimba toad's 3 largest populations lived on Mount Signal Sempere, inside the mining concession secured by the company. So you see this red area, that's the area where one of the populations of the Nimba toad lived. This was, the yellow area was a mining concession for SMFG. In a gesture of corporate responsibility and care, the company removed the mountain from the mine plan as a set-aside, a key argument in the company's communication. Toad and mountain became locked in a relation of codependence. The Nimba toad's endemicity affected the survival of rocks and animals. Entanglements of life and non-life, of toad and mountain, wield power in the growing nexus of conservation and mining. And now part 3, viruses. Precious iron ore and rare animal species are not the only attractors to the Mount Nimba region. Viruses, which confound the distinction between the animate and inanimate, also draw attention. They, too, have come to accrue value out of the fragmented landscape of Mount Nimba. In 2017, ArcelorMittal orchestrated the translocation of bats living in an old mining adit on Mount Nimba, the one I showed you at the beginning. The project was a purported act of care, rendered as a biodiversity offset for the company's plans to extend open cast mining to a new peak in the region. But in the wake of the 2013-16 West African Ebola outbreak, the largest recorded epidemic of the fatal disease, precautionary steps seem warranted. ArcelorMittal's environmental manager had heard bats could be carriers of Ebola. Would bat translocation pose a risk of a disease spillover? A Liberian-based team of PREDICT, a consortium funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, happened to be sampling wildlife for viruses in the region. Jim Desmond, a charismatic cowboy virus hunter and director of the PREDICT team, was delighted to offer the team's services to help minimize risks posed by the translocation of potentially disease-carrying bats. ArcelorMittal provided the necessary infrastructure to carry out the work. In exchange, virus hunters donned protective suits and helped capture more than 2,000 bats at dusk. Moses came to help. He and his colleagues placed bats by the handful into cages, stacked the cages in pickup trucks, and took the flying mammals to their new home, a concrete tunnel built by ArcelorMittal near Blue Lake. Before the bats' release, the PREDICT team collected the blood and swabbed the orifices of hundreds of bats in search for the elusive origins of Ebola. In a blood sample taken from a great long-fingered bat, the team detected an RNA fragment of Ebola Zaire virus. It was the first time Ebola Zaire virus was found in a bat in West Africa. Habitat fragmentation figures prominently in ecological tales told of the causal drivers that sparked the 2013-16 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. In 2015, the Environmental Foundation for Africa, a Sierra Leone-based NGO, published a study of the relationships between changing land use, forest fragmentation, bat ecology, and Ebola virus disease. Their investigation included a village in Guinea Forestière, several hundred kilometers west of Nimba, where the outbreak is thought to have originated. Using satellite-based data and mathematic modeling, the NGO found a common pattern in 6 of 7 Ebola outbreaks in Africa. Deforestation that resulted in more isolated patches of forest in a landscape mosaic of forest farms and plantations led to a greater likelihood of an Ebola outbreak. The group recommended protecting large forest blocks from fragmentation to minimize human-wildlife contact and the risk of zoonotic spillover. The Ebola risk maps produced by EFA owe their origins to another hotspot concept that has come to dominate growing concerns around pandemics in the Anthropocene. In 2008, a group that included Peter Daszak from the Wildlife Trust, later renamed EcoHealth Alliance, published a letter in Nature that was instrumental in shaping U.S. federal policy on pandemic preparedness. The authors analyzed data from more than 300 emerging infectious disease events that occurred between 1940 and 2004. Approximately 60% of these events were associated with zoonoses, the majority of which originated in wildlife. Their conclusion: low latitude, biodiversity-rich tropical rainforest regions in Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia were the highest risk, quote, hotspots for zoonosis and posed the greatest threat to global health. And so this is a map that shows their views of the highest risk of emerging infectious disease hotspots for vector-borne diseases. And you'll see the ways, again, in which the upper Ghanaian, the Ghanaian forests of West Africa map almost identically onto the biodiversity hotspots of Norman Meyer's maps. The next year, USAID launched PREDICT. Over 10 years, the program spent more than $200 million furthering research, strengthening surveillance, and increasing laboratory capacity, all aimed at discovering and detecting zoonotic pathogens at the human-wildlife interface. EcoHealth Alliance, ArcelorMittal's infrastructures of extraction, and biosecurity concerns had brought Jim Desmond and his PREDICT team to survey wildlife for viruses in Nimba. 5 years later, their finding of a fragment of Ebola Zaire virus has yet to be published. But the finding has acquired evidentiary value in environmental critiques that mobilize the concept of the disease hotspot to incriminate different types of land use contributing to deforestation. Mining is one. Nimba figures prominently, for example, in a recent Reuters report on jump zones, where bat viruses are most likely to spill over into human population as a result of habitat destruction. The web page is glossy, replete with large pictures of furry bats, aerial shot videos, infographics, and global heat maps visualizing hotspots of endangerment. The message is clear. As trees are cut to clear roads and job seekers migrate to Nimba, quote, mining eats into bat land. Spillover risk was already high when ArcelorMittal took over the mine and has only increased since, the Reuters report claims. Who to blame for forest fragmentation and, by inference, disease outbreaks is deeply contested among conservation NGOs, mining companies, and local people. This became evident when we interviewed the environmental manager for the mining company SMFG, who also happened to be chair of the 2015 EFA study. If this theory of fragmentation holds, he exclaimed, then of course mining can open a corridor for contact, but so too can slash and burn agriculture, he exclaimed. Mining companies, NGOs, conservation biologists, and virus hunters each find value in a virus inhabiting a fragment of the Ghanaian forest and advancing contested and collaborative visions of land use that greatly affect the interrelations and futures of human, non-human, and inanimate beings of Mount Nimba. Some scientists, meanwhile, are critical of the hullabaloo around the so-called discovery of Ebola virus in a Nimba bat. And this is the artificial cave that was built by ArcelorMittal for the translocation of the bat. So that's where that's located on the East Nimba Nature Reserve. A bat specialist whom we met at a conference on African small mammals in Namibia, where a fault line ran between virologists and conservationists, reminded us that, quote, fragments are no ecology. Bits of RNA tell nothing about the complex interrelations and historical processes through which bats came to inhabit an old mining adit in Mount Nimba, or how a virus, which the mammals may be a reservoir for, came to infect and kill thousands of people across Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And now to conclude. In a snippet of Zaire Ebola virus, taken from a Nimba longfinger bat that lived in an abandoned mining adit in a fragment of the Ghanaian forest, the scales and histories of the hotspot converge. Hotspots, we argue, depend upon fragments. Fragments are by definition parts broken off, detached, incomplete. The uneven edges of fragments attract unlikely gatherings. Fragments remind us of that which once was. For some, they beckon nostalgia and beg repair. For others, they signal new futures, inviting salvage and reuse. Fragments create value. In Nimba, codependencies, trade-offs, and quest for profit bind together bats, toads, trees, lateritic rocks, and viruses. As private businesses and the state embrace revised social and civic responsibilities, modes of care morph from paternalistic provision of worker welfare to neoliberal care of the more than human. The hotspot reworks strata of causality, responsibility, and duty into modes of governance. These are by no means exclusive. They overlap or fracture in relation to different arrangements of life and non-life. But capital demands difference, and difference demands fragmentation. Mount Nimba has been fragmented into pieces of worth: iron ore and timber, rare toads and viruses, in the ever-changing production and extraction of value from nature. Fragmentation, dissolution, and cataclysmic breaks are something of a motif of the Anthropocene. Fragments call for management and care. We hold that their governance, replete with promises and hopes of repair and restoration, is both the epitome of and a litmus test for late extractive industries. In these fragmented landscapes, unexpected and tenuous alliances emerge among rocks, plants, animals, viruses, and people. Past relations are severed, new bonds are forged, and uneasy compromises are found in the disarray and order that cycles of capitalist extraction unleash and seek to impose. But Moses is confident that the forest will once again become whole. As we hike up the Sika Valley, beneath Blue Lake, where each rainy season has brought its lot of fragmented rocks, rusty steel rods, and concrete pieces, he directs Emma's attention to the two forest blocks separated by the riverbed. He smiles. Look, they are coming together. Thank you.